So my question is, why is it that we may get a scenario where, as much as people hate gridlock and hate Congress as it stands now, we're going to be stuck with another 2 years of divided government? Why does that happen?
I think it's because of the way our system works. I'm going to be completely honest with you. When I started working for Leslie's show back in 2006, I thought I knew a lot about politics, and it's taken me, a long time to learn more and more, and not the things that they teach you in college, like you're talking about at Syracuse and in the textbooks. For instance, redistricting. That's not something I remember learning about, but my God, is that really just affect our political system drastically. You have what was called an off year in elections, extremely low voter turnout in the 2010 midterms. And look at how important that election turned out to be, because the redistricting was done. And what that, as all know, but some of our listeners may not, what that allows to do is whoever is in power gets to redraw the lines for congressional races, so they can kind of carve out the territory they want to have the voting population they want, so that they have a much better chance of winning those races. So no matter how poor their party does, and this could be argued both sides, Democrats or Republicans, no matter how poor the party does on actual real issues over the 2-year period before the next election happens, they really have to screw up to lose control of the one of the bodies of Congress. Now, we did see that, I think, almost happen, or it seemed like it was going to happen following the government shutdown. In the generic congressional race polls, you saw Democrats polling ahead of Republicans by a very large margin. However, following that, unfortunately, the I guess you would just call it very poor rollout initially of the Affordable Care Act gave Republicans something to, get up and scream about and distract from the debacle that they had just, run amok in the Capitol. And it looks like it worked, because now I think they thrive on gridlock. Honestly, this current Republican Party, comprised of a lot of Tea Partiers and a lot of Republicans who I think are afraid of the Tea Party, and it swings them to the right. So what you see is they like gridlock because it gives them an excuse to not get anything done, whereas I think, you could make arguments about specific congressional members and senators that don't feel that way, but I think the Republican Party as a whole right now, that you see in power anyway, not necessarily the voters, they're very happy with this because it allows them to continue to be power brokers, get the things done that they want done, and they always have an excuse in their back pocket to say, well, look, here's the problem, we have gridlock. And I'm sure some Democrats do the same, but I sense a lot more frustration on the Democratic side that, you have a president of your party, and, that's supposed to be this great and powerful thing. But, I think you could argue that the Supreme Court has made more big changes than the president has over the past, say, 4 years. We talked about Citizens United last hour. That's the biggest change I can think of in our country in the last 4 years. I think that's bigger than the healthcare law, because that affects literally everything you do. Name your number one issue. For me, the reason it is campaign finance reform is whatever else I say is number two doesn't matter, because until you get the grips of money out of politics, and you get the grips of money that it has on these congressional members and these senators, it literally doesn't matter what you care about. You do not matter. You can go and vote, and you can get, pissed off, and you can scream at the top of your lungs, and you can get organized, but until you get organized enough to put enough pressure on your congressperson and your senator, and you get all of your friends and your family to do it, and you have a movement that was, let's say, as big as the civil rights movement or pretty damn close, you're not going to get a constitutional amendment, which it's really going to take to get money out of politics. So I hate to be a pessimist because I'm just not that type of person, but I do think it's going to have to get much, much worse before it gets better. And we may see that next week with the McCutcheon v. FEC ruling.
Can it get any worse? It's pretty bad now.
Yeah. You just heard right now, okay, it's like you just said, it's as bad as it is now. We're talking about the Koch brothers. Well, we're talking about the Koch brothers, Sheldon Adelson, Crossroads GPS. We know those are names, okay? We know what they do. We know the money that they're injecting into these races. However, now you have a guy like McCutcheon who was able to spend about, I think it was $123,000 and change. Now he's going to be able to spend $2.4 million every election cycle. How many other people out there are just like him? Plenty. So it's not just that they're going to affect these big national races. What happens is they're going to affect the gubernatorial races, and they're going to affect the state legislatures. And guess what we just saw when you have a really whacked out state legislature? Well, SB 1062 in Arizona. Once everybody heard about it nationally, they're all scratching their heads going, is this really happened? This really passed a state legislature? How does that happen? Well, you just answered your own question. Look who's putting these people in office. Do you think it's the people of that district? A lot of the times it's not. It's the money that's putting these people in the power to run. And then once they are the only candidates, what does everybody do? They say, oh, yeah, there's 2 or 3 people running. I don't really like any of them. Well, how did we get to that point? We got to that point because you need over $1 million to run for Congress, and you need something like over $3 million to run for the Senate. So no one has, many people don't have a fighting chance. And if they do, the problem is they get to Washington, D.C., they feel very passionate about what they want to do to help the people. But then how do they do it? How do they continue to run and win elections? They have to make bedfellows with people that do not share their values. And maybe they only think they'll do it once or twice, but sure enough, you've been there for 2 or 3 terms, and you look at what you were 2 or 3 terms ago when you started running, and I bet you don't even recognize yourself. I mean, I'm sorry. It just makes me feel sick to my stomach. I hate it. And I wish that, it would change, but wishing's not good enough. You have to, I think we do have a lot of hope in the millennial generation, like you've talked about, Brad, where we've talked with Marty Winograd, or is it Marty and, what are their names?
Marty Winograd, Mike Hayes.
Mike Hayes. They've talked about that collective spirit of people who will mobilize and will get off their butts and, knock on doors, go to the Capitol, do what you did, even though the labor movement lost in Wisconsin when you saw what Scott Walker was able to do to collective bargaining. I think the last 2 indications you've seen that people can do that this day and age was the Occupy Wall Street movement and was the labor movement in Wisconsin. Now, you could argue that they didn't achieve their goals, but I still think you saw an example of how when you have a lightning rod that gets people angry or just passionate enough to do something, that with the way technology is now today, it's not that hard to organize. I mean, we have more tools at disposal now than we ever have in our history. So I think we just have to get enough people, basically woken up to really what's going on. And that's the hardest part because, a lot of people I think are just, you can make a lot of excuses. A lot of people are very busy. I mean, right now our worker productivity is up. We just actually had the labor secretary on a couple weeks ago, and one of the things that stood out that he said to Leslie was worker productivity is up 90% since 1977, and wages are only up 3%. So people are being asked to do more to put food on the table. So a lot of the times you're working a second job, and by the time you get home, a lot of people just veg out. I'm going to be honest. I mean, a lot of people do not pay attention as much as we do because this is what we do for a living. Well, if they, for instance, work for a bank or, they're an accountant, how much do they read and do they pay attention to? Well, I bet you they didn't hear about this Arizona bill until maybe yesterday or the day before. We have to find a way to get people engaged earlier in the process.
Yeah,
I think that's
we
the
do.
trick.